I think we have a couple of really interesting panels today. We're going to start with the strategic planning panel. We have our guests here. Starting from my left, we have Peter Fasciano. Peter is well known in Boston media circles from his past positions as an early pioneer at Avid Technologies, where he was a VP for Advanced Development. He previously served as General Manager for Cable Access Operations at Medfield TV, and he is currently Executive Director at Franklin TV and WFPR FM. To Peter's left, we have Eric Curtis. Eric Curtis is a strategy consultant and author focusing on helping nonprofits unlock their potential for growth and greater social impact. He has advised colleges and universities, human services, healthcare, trade associations, and many other charitable organizations. His work has included building transformational strategic plans, developing governing boards, and supporting large change efforts. Eric is deeply passionate about unlocking the potential of nonprofits to make our world a better place. And to Eric's left is Rob Zargis. Rob is a 22-year veteran in nonprofit management, specializing in strategic planning, executive coaching, and organizational capacity building. Rob's career includes work with at-risk populations at the Meriden, Connecticut Juvenile Justice Center, as Town of Wallingford Youth Director, and as New England Director for Straight Ahead Ministries, Inc. of Worcester, Mass., where he developed programs and services for juvenile offenders and at-risk youth. In 2013, he helped lead the organization through its strategic plan. Rob is currently the Interim Executive Director of Somerville Community Access Television, where he played an integral role in developing the organization's recently released strategic plan. He is also an adjunct professor of nonprofit management at Clark University, a dedicated Boy Scout volunteer, has coached basketball on the collegiate and high school level, and football at the high school level, served as a camp director, coached youth lacrosse, and served on numerous boards and with various organizations as a volunteer. So if we could just give a warm welcome to our panelists. And again, thank you all for being here today. So I wanted to just start off with, I was looking online trying to get a good definition of strategic planning. And I found this, and I think it's a pretty strong definition, sums up everything. Strategic planning is an organizational management activity that is used to set priorities, focus energy and resources, strengthen operations, ensure that employees and other stakeholders are working toward common goals, establish agreement around intended outcomes and results, and assess and adjust the organization's direction in response to a changing environment. It is a disciplined effort that produces fundamental decisions and actions that shape and guide what an organization is, who it serves, what it does, and why it does it, with a focus on the future. Effective strategic planning articulates not only where an organization is going and the actions needed to make progress, but also how it will know if it is successful. So with that, I wanted to ask you guys, during your time putting together strategic plans, helping to put together strategic plans, what specifically was your role in the process? And if we could start with Peter.
Well, that kind of varies in that I've lived a few different lives in my career. Before Avid, I ran a production company in Boston, staff of 50, which I had established. And so in that phase of my life, I was a mom and pop businessman who built up a pretty good business. And my learning of how it's all done in that day, not only television production, but just having a business without having an MBA, there were a lot of blind sides and things I didn't know. So it was sort of making it up as I went along. But one of the things that really helped, and one of the things that became our hallmark when I was running the studio, is just being really organized in the back office. That is, our business processes, our way that we tracked projects that we were doing was very buttoned up and all computerized back in the late 70s. So we knew where our budget was, we knew what we were spending and what it was on, and how we could make decisions going forward. And so things like staffing, growth, what do we need to do next, a lot of that came out of just understanding the numbers. So that gave me an appreciation, first person, the hard way, of what it means to understand business administration. So I put that as a core. Just really knowing where your finances and your numbers are, and having tools in place to be able to express that the way you want. Today with Excel and a whole bunch of great programs beyond that, it's become far easier to do than ever. Second phase, in the late 80s, I moved on to help a good friend of mine start another business, Avid Technology. And so my role changed from being a principal of a small company to playing a role in a much larger company. And in that role, what I brought to starting Avid was domain expertise. And so I was, among others, the first voice of the consumer of the product, and had the privilege working with Bill Warner of designing the original Avid system. And I then, as Avid grew, took on the responsibility of really managing the company's future, running an advanced development group of a core people of about up to a dozen, whose goal was to live 5 years ahead of everybody else. Now, it tends to sound a little romantic, but it's actually hard because everyone thinks you're nuts. But to understand the push and the pull of all that, bear in mind that all of the other people around you are very much dealing with the present day and present day concerns and what do I need to do right now. Whereas my charter was, how do I keep things from the next 3 to 5 years from jumping up and biting us or hurting us, or where do we need to go next for the next great breakthrough. And communicating that internally in a rapidly growing company has challenges that change. And you touched on it when you were talking about the definition of strategy and how it is that you become a thought leader, and that's a key phrase, a thought leader in an organization. So people say, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. This person has a real vision. And so if there's anything that drives strategy, it is that people perceive that you have a vision. And then finally, in where I am now at Franklin, the organization had been running for about 5 years without that vision. Kind of necessity. Nobody did anything bad, but the case was, as many of you know, that this is a common story where Comcast decides they don't want to support a TV studio anymore, and they pass the TV studio off to the respective town when Verizon shows up, and Comcast and Verizon both make capital contributions to supporting the studio, along with the usual access fees. So the town inherited the studio in Franklin in 2007. The same is true in my hometown in Framingham and in other places. And at that point, there's usually some sort of caretaking. Someone is trying to organize and run the facility, but there isn't a real long-term plan in place. So there's no strategy in place. And it's a very interesting place to be as a PEG studio without any vision and without any leadership. In fairness to the respective towns, the towns understand that they don't want to be in the TV studio business either, but they inherited this squirming thing, which is a PEG studio, and usually it's a stepping stone towards establishing a third-party group. Hence us, Franklin Community Cable Access, FCCA, doing business as Franklin TV. But the town's cable board said we need to have a formal organization with a formal charter, an agreement with the town. All that stuff needs to be put in. So their vision wasn't about how to run the studio or how to make it all go, but their vision was just to get organized. And that was the key point you touched on in the very beginning. So So that's what the cable board did. And so they were sort of running in place for 4 years while they established all the key things, the bylaws of the organization, articles of incorporation, the agreement with the town as a formal contract, what was going to happen and how to express all that in language. And quite frankly, I do not fault them for the way they did it. I think they did a brilliant job, because if you look at our website and you read our language, all of these documents are posted on our website. And I have greater and greater respect for what the town actually did in terms of strategy to get ready to be great. And then when FCCA was formed and the agreements were put in place, the town had also amassed a fair amount of cash. They ran the place on a sort of minimal placeholder budget, and kept all of the cable access fees in a running account, which they should do. So we had something of a war chest when I showed up. So everything that happened before me in terms of strategy, the person who's most grateful for the way that the town actually did it all is me, because they spring-loaded me for success. There was another gentleman, Bob Dean, who was really Mr. Cable in our town, but it was all in his head. He was sort of handling everything as a one-man band and doing a great job. Bob Dean, quite unfortunately, had a pretty serious stroke just as things were about to get off the ground, so he was out of commission. So I showed up on day one with no staff, no history, nobody to talk to, and a tightrope system that was 2 days away from stopping. And it was in a little hovel in the back. So for me, strategy was don't die. But I spent the first 3 or 4 months just fixing a lot of broken stuff in a firefight, technically, to get the organization to be technically competent. Got things set to right, made all the bad stuff go away, like the snowy pictures and the hiccups and the black on the air and all that other stuff. So just doing that, getting it clean, was emergency strategy. And that brought me to the point where we are in today's discussion. Okay, what are we doing on the long term? The next thing on my list of many things to do was put together a business development plan for the town. The town had given our fledgling organization enough money to survive for 9 months to a year. They gave us just enough money to get right side up and get going. And in exchange, first thing in our list was put together a development plan and a strategic plan going forward. We will review that plan, and if we feel like you people are being reasonably competent, we'll provide you the rest of the funding. So I did a business development plan, provided it to them about 2 months before their anticipated deadline. We had plenty of time to talk about it with the town administration and so forth, and we got the rest of our funding pretty straightforward. And then I started a building campaign and everything else after that. But the essence of that plan was to very rapidly do a couple of things. Number one, educate my board. Now this gets back to the vision and the leadership position. To convey to my board of directors that if I don't know where I'm going, wait 5 minutes, I'll figure it out. I will have a vision if you don't think I have one right now. Wait 5 minutes. Move quickly. Be urgent. Don't hesitate. Don't buy time. Move. And that was the thing that drove me in the beginning. Urgency is critical. I drove my board around to about a dozen facilities, including this one. Rich gave us a nickel tour back then, our president and a couple of other board members. And so what I was doing was very quickly ramping up my board of directors to get a bunch of voices in from other places, Foxborough, here, Acton, Wakefield, etc. And Robert at Access AV pointed me to a couple of other places that I really ought to have a look at. And that developed for them a very, very quick a visual reference that says, all right, this guy has a pretty good idea of where we need to go. He gave us a tour of all these places and talked about, why they are wired the way they are, et cetera. And we developed a common base. And then with an educated board now feeling comfortable with the fact that I'm going to figure this out, that's where our development plan came from. They participated in the process, and I made sure that they could quickly. And then after that, the other thing I did is I looked up every other nonprofit in town, contacted them all very rapidly, got them engaged, put them up on our community bulletin board, started a dialogue with every one of them, and doing needs assessment with how it is that we could be helpful to them as a bully pulpit, and start creating some relevance for our organization. All of that happened within the first 6 to 9 months. And then, oh, by the way, we also went out now shopping for a building, so that way we could actually purchase a place, which we did. So all of that happened from April of 2012 to the end of April, to the end of the year. So it was very fast-moving time. And then after that, we could go into longer-term planning. So our time horizon kept going out further and further as we got more comfortable with the fact that we were on solid ground. So strategy for the week became strategy for a few months, became strategy for the first year, became strategy for a 5-year plan, which we now do have in place.
Thank you. Eric?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. My role in strategic planning is a little different. Not being a staff member, I come in as a facilitator to help boards, to help the teams go through the strategic planning process. So what that looks like is really creating a plan to get from here to there, but it's really about the people. And how do we get alignment from the board, from the leadership team, the staff, and stakeholders in the community all aligned to where we want to go to as an organization. So that's really my role, is to create that plan that everyone has helped to build and that we can all move in the same direction together.
Thank you, Eric. Rob?
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I've been on both sides of that equation. Over the years as an executive director, I've asked for facilitators to come in and help to develop a strategic plan, and in my current role I am doing the facilitation and implementation of strategic planning. And seems like a daunting task, but it's something that can be broken down into very bite-sized pieces so that you get the right input and really start to be able to articulate your mission and vision as an organization. And I appreciate you really hitting that vision statement over and over again. Your mission and your vision drives your strategy. Your values drives your culture. And if you're not clear on who you are, that might be the first place you start in the strategic planning process, is getting really clear on who you are and where you want to be when you grow up, right? And that's difficult right now in this field because of the changing landscape. So being really clear on understanding your environment and how that might impact who you want to be in 5 years, as the field changes pretty rapidly right now, both on the technology side, but also on how community access television is going to be provided in the future potentially.
Thank you, Rob. I also want to say that at the end we will have time to do Q&A, so if you have questions, we can pass around the microphone and ask. So the next question I have, what we'll do is we'll move each person, so we'll have Eric start the next one. So during a strategic planning, during the process, how many people were involved? Do you feel like it's better to have a larger group? Should you have people from outside of the organization be a part of this? Who do you think should be involved in the process?
Sure. A good analogy for that is, as an employee, if you've ever had an annual review done by your boss, you have one person giving you feedback on your performance. Now, equate that to engaging that employer, as well as your peers, as well as your subordinates, and doing a 360 review. The more people that you engage to give you perspective on how you're coming across as an employee, the more information is going to be valuable to you to make changes in how you govern your day. Same thing in strategic planning. You want to be able to engage stakeholders that are going to be able to support what you do, but you can't just do that in a vacuum. A lot of organizations will do a board retreat, and they're entering that board retreat with a lack of information. They don't have an understanding of that 360. What are the staff looking at? What do the staff see as the opportunities and the threats coming down the pike? What are the stakeholders in the community looking at? What do they see? How are we taking that information, pooling that together and seeing what data corroborates and what data matches, and then using those to build the strategic goals? So to answer your question, I think the more the merrier, but you want to know who you're engaging and why. And then you want to understand what baseline questions that you're going to ask everybody to get that kind of corroborating data. But then you may engage partners such as foundations, town selectmen, nonprofits in the town, in the community, as well as your staff. And you'll want to ask them very specific questions, because if you build a strategic plan together, the people that help build it now have ownership and buy-in in that plan. So the planning process itself is very strategic, because ideally when you have completed the plan, everyone agrees to the direction, so you're all stepping off in one direction together. You're operating on the same playing field with the same sheet of music and marching to the same beat. And that's really the value. So the more you can engage, the better, but you really have to be selective as to who.
Thank you. Rob, with your recently released strategic plan, obviously you're fresh in your mind. Who worked with you? How big of a group did you have?
Yeah, so there was quite a bit of constituent feedback in the process to kind of inform development of the strategic plan. I think that's incredibly important. Again, you want to be selective, and you don't want to ask every single person in the world. Otherwise, it takes you a year to do your strategic plan, and it should never take. By the way, it should never take a year to do a strategic plan. We need to be really clear that when we have a vision for a preferred future, and the only reason you'll be involved in strategic planning is, I think, two reasons. One is the board is responsible for making sure that the executive director and the staff at this nonprofit has clear, measurable objectives to reach in order to get where you want to go in reaching your fulfilling your mission and your vision as an organization. And two, it becomes a rallying cry for all its constituents. And in this field, it would be staff, board, community, and members of the Access Center. And so it's incredibly important to get a lot of feedback from a lot of different people, but to also measure that, right? Because you have very different constituents when you're in an organization. And those constituents have different expectations of the organization. So if you have a funder, be it Comcast, they have very different expectations of Scat TV than my member does that's coming in to learn how to do Final Cut Pro. Very different expectations, and their feedback to me, both extremely valuable, but also measured in a way that says we need to make sure that we're providing community access to our members, but we also have to be responsible to the people that pay for what we do here. And so those two different constituent groups, both valuable input, but we have to measure really about how we plan our strategy going forward, so that not only are we getting that feedback, but that as we put our plans together and our objectives, and we drive that down through the organization, so that our front desk attendant is fully aware of how his or her contribution to the organization is feeding into the strategic plan. But they also know that the constituent that comes in there, we have responsibility to them as well. So strategic planning, while you want to have a lot of input, you also have to measure that, and also that's what drives your focus areas of your strategic plan, which then becomes your measurable objectives.
Thank you. Peter, you've mentioned a little bit, but some of the people that you worked with, can you explain a little bit?
Well, I want to touch on the 360 point that we brought up earlier, because it is a great perspective in terms of setting up a strategy. And also what you were talking about ties into that really well. 360 is kind of an abstraction about getting feedback from several sources. But now let's just organize those sources the way you were talking about. And if you think of them as spheres, circles call it a big Venn diagram of multiples. But one that often gets overlooked is the audience, the general viewing audience. And then for my spheres, it was one just for the government, the administration, the town council, the varying governing bodies, et cetera, and how we cover their government meetings. Then there's the educational sphere, the schools, the superintendent, the principals, the people that we shoot many events for. Then there are people doing programming already at our place, and people that we'd like to have doing programming at our place.
Right.
And among others that you've touched on. And so having all of these sort of categorized and being able to say, all right, what drives them to be associated with us? How do we give value to them? Is a way to sort of solidify the abstraction of a 360 review, and to have a regular dialogue going on with them and a list of questions, concerns for all of them. So I think both of you have really sort of built on and described well sort of what I did quite naturally in my process. And I also want to underscore audience. We have a bit of an oxymoronic mandate. Number one, we want to create programming for people, or help them create programming. The other thing we want to do is create programming that the audience really wants to watch. And so how it is that we find a way to get those two things to be as close together as possible is really critical. And that speaks to a new way to think about what we do. Number one, our charter going back to the 80s was, we had the heavy iron, we had the cameras, and we had a channel, and we had those racks of videotape machines that you could edit with, stuff people couldn't get to. So our proposition was very hardware intense and solved the high barrier to entry that existed in a pre-digital era. Now, every kid walking around with a camera and a laptop in their knapsack is a TV studio that can go directly to the world. So our original charter is perceived as less valuable by many. For me, the new charter coming out of, again, strategy is, what do we do on the creative side?
Right.
How do we make programs that these people never thought that they could make?
Right.
And that changes the charter, changes the direction for the long term. So very much I've moved from the high tech to the high touch side. Working on concept, working on direction, working on production, working on set design, working on creating a building that is attractive to be in as a generalized media center beyond cable. So that's a very broad sweeping statement, but that's sort of where we are in terms of vision, philosophy, culture that came out of the feedback we had.
Yeah.
And then finally, one other thing that's an interesting overlay on everything that you guys were talking about. I use the word client.
Yeah.
Coming out of the business world, anybody who steps over that threshold and into my front lobby, client, right there on the forehead. Treat them that way. And so I want to make my client jumping up and down happy. And that goes to our culture. So people come in, we assume the best, we strive for the best, we help them try to be their best, and to create television that they never dreamed about doing. And that is an abiding culture that I keep on working on. And also in our organization, just as critical of that is our attitude. Regardless of what they do or don't know, we appreciate them. And I think that's an underlying part of strategy that's important, is how you set your tone.
Yep.
So looking at everybody who comes in the door as a client, the spheres, the 360 review, all of those different directions, all clients. That's how you develop a service mentality.
Thank you. We're going to start with Rob on this one, and I wanted to talk a little bit about mission statements, which is the summary of an organization's focus, purpose. Do you feel that a mission statement should be created before the strategic plan, or should it be created because of the strategic plan? In other words, should the strategic plan lead to the mission statement, or should you have your mission statement wrap around your mission statement?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because I've been in nonprofit work as an adult, since I worked. I've never worked anywhere else but in nonprofit work, and the reality is nonprofits are driven by mission. We exist as nonprofits because of the public trust in our mission statement. That's why we get some of the benefits we get as nonprofit organizations. And so your mission should be driving everything that you do. So that should drive your strategy. Now, there are times in the evolution of the life cycle of an organization in which a mission statement needs to be revisited. You could have solved world hunger, and you no longer need to be an organization that resolves world hunger, right? So you would have to revisit that or dissolve. And so many times in the life cycle organization, you see a mission statement that's no longer either valid or really is not aligned with what we're doing anymore, right? And that's when you start to create real difficulty in developing strategy, because if your mission statement, what drives you as an organization, is no longer aligned with maybe where your funding streams are coming from, or where the passion in your organization or your capacity of your organization, when those things become misaligned, the strategy doesn't have an endpoint in which to arrive at. So depending on where in the life cycle the organization is, will dictate whether or not the mission statement needs to be revisited. Many times that I've done strategic planning with organizations, the first question I ask is this mission still valid? And most of the board can't tell me what the mission statement is. That's an organization where an executive director perhaps could have spent more time focusing on educating their board and constituents and staff on what are we really about here, right? Because if the organization as a whole, that means all of your internal board, staff, leadership, does not know why you're here, it's really hard to determine whether or not you're doing a good job. And you can get easily distracted by the next shiny bauble that comes down the road. Oh, we should do this, we should do that. And there's nothing to hold the organization to where we've agreed that we want to go as an organization, right? So when you do articles of incorporation, you state why you exist. That's what your mission statement is. So, and again, mission and vision drives the strategy. Your values, how we are with each other, client-centered, whatever language you choose to use in your organization, drives your culture. So what we do is driven by your mission and vision, your strategy. Well, who we are and how we treat each other is driven by our values, right? All of those should be evident and be able to be repeated back, almost parroted back by the people that are you're having involved in your organization. I would say even to the client level should know exactly why SCAT-TV exists. To what, right? And so when we revisit those, and that's we're actually going to be doing that exercise at SCAT in middle of October. We're going to be revisiting the mission and vision statement because it no longer aligns with where we want to go. Did it backwards. Strategy came, and then they realized misaligned with, as I arrived, I said, well, here's your strategy, here's your mission. Do you see a problem here? Oh, yeah, we see problems. And no wonder, so what does that mean, right? So what if you're misaligned? It's just a statement on a wall or a piece of paper. Not so much, because when you find that your employees are unclear, what do you drive them to in order to help them get clear about why they show up to work every day? Hopefully it's not their job description, because we know those go out the window pretty much the first day you start your job, right? You know that phrase, and any other duties as directed.
That may be defined by.
Yeah. So like that encompasses a whole lot, right? The first thing I do with all employees when I go into a new organization is say, all right, here's your job description. Now tell me what you do, right? I don't want to look at that really. I want you to tell me what you do in it. How do you spend your time, and how does that drive towards either an established strategy that exists, your personal goals that you have in your role, that drive into a larger focus area, that drives into the strategy that you have to reach your mission. And you see how it all kind of flows up from the person who you consider your newest employee all the way up to the executive director. And then the board then has something to hold the executive director to. How are we on mission accomplishment should be the major question that a board is asking their the leadership of the organization. How are we doing on achieving our mission?
Top
right?
metric.
Yeah, that is your bottom line in your social return on investment in your organization, right? So when then you can articulate that both quantitatively and quantitatively, depending on how you measure your metrics along the way. You give Comcast certain things, you give other funders certain things, you give your board members your financials, you give them, but you should be we need to be reporting on how we're doing against the strategy. How do you lead without a roadmap? Otherwise, you have to make it up. And then anyone in the organization then is also free to make it up. Oh, we should start, you know what we should do? We should take our 29-minute shows and break them up into 4-minute clips so we can put them on YouTube. Well, is that our mission? No, it's not our mission right now. It's something we should be looking at, how we use other platforms to use our production to get the word out and to have production that people can come in and do that, right? And pocket production, right? We're talking that's a phrase that's all over the place right now. Is that part of what we want to be about, or is it what we should be about? Because who are our constituents and our consumers, but as importantly, who are the people that are keeping these lights on right now? We have to make sure that we're faithful to them as well. So there's a lot when it comes to strategy, especially in this landscape, that if you're not clear and your organization as a whole is not clear around that, but mission drives strategy, not the other way around.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Good point on mission, and some anecdotes about mission statements gone wrong. And I don't say this negatively because it's a perception thing. Abbott went through a number of management changes over the years, and the chairman of the board asked me if I would sit down and have dinner with Bill Miller, which was sort of customary when we went through a change. I would contribute something of corporate memory to the incoming leadership. So Bill Miller and I sat down and had a somewhat long and pleasant dinner, just sort of getting to know each other. And I wanted him to understand that if he needed any information, that's why I was there for him. But I said to him something that was interesting in terms of my perception where the company was at the time. I said, Bill, I want you to walk around the corridor and I want you to ask 20 people what we do. This is to your point,
That's
right?
huge.
And I said, I'm going to guarantee you're going to get 20 different answers. And perhaps the more disconcerting thing is a lot of those answers that you're going to get are what I call inward looking. What I was trying to help him address was that here's a company, now me as a domain expert, a person sort of the cloth in production, broadcast, etc. Someone characterized as Abbott's client, getting back to that notion, and here's Abbott as a high-tech company where the vast majority of people on the staff don't have my experience. And they came from other high-tech companies that did other things. So they're sort of generically skilled in creating product. So I said to Bill, walk around, get your answers, and a lot of the answers will be sort of inward-looking, where people will give you references about what it is they're doing without a lot of client connection. And so I'm asking you a question, or asking you to walk around with this question, but I also owe you the first answer. And in noodling this, I want to describe who we are as users. Whether you are editing a movie, writing a movie, producing a movie, whatever it is, and when I say movie, it could be a commercial, a TV series, call it whatever you will, but we're creating some kind of content. We all come from a heritage of telling stories. We are all storytellers, the camera people, the editors. If we're applying our craft properly, we are focused on helping producer, director tell that story with drama and depth and emotion. So what do we do at Abbott in the broadest calling of what we do? If we're really focused on a great mission, present and future, it is that we create tools for storytellers. And that became Abbott's mission statement in 1998. and Bill ran with that, and he sort of used it as his mantra. Now the difficulty is that all the product managers and all the other people within the company simply said, "Oh, tools for storytellers. That means yet another editor." They couldn't get that to be more than what the company was already doing. So it was a good mission statement. It wasn't moving us in the right direction. Then when David Krall came in as the new CEO, about 4 years later, we had the same discussion. And I gave him the history of tools for storytelling and all that. But I said, David, there's another exercise maybe we could do together. And on this one, I'm not going to give you the answer. I don't have the answer. But there is something that we do in making product. And it's a great way to create any mission statement. I was taught about, in product development or creating something, the process of value analysis. Value analysis came up actually many decades ago as an exercise in brevity to describe what something does in only 2 words, verb and a noun. So you have a verb and an object noun. Refrigerator cools food, simple enough. But now do that for every single part in the refrigerator. What the motor does, what the hinges do, what the ductwork, etc. And the idea is you're trying to bring efficiency to every single component of the beast. So I said, now think about Avid, and what do we do? Describe it in a verb and a noun. And that ultimately, in the span of about 48 hours, led us to make, manage, move media. Oh, interesting. Now, those 2 mission statements are both great mission statements. But both of those great mission statements accomplish very different things. So I tell that story because I want you to understand the power of a mission statement when it works and the power of a mission statement when it doesn't. It can throw you off. So you got to keep revisiting and revisiting. Now, make, manage, and move media suddenly solved that first problem I described of, we're making yet another editor. It got us to think about tools for origination, tools for servers, etc. And so that's what the strategic group within Avid was charted as doing, was helping the leadership to lead. And I think that maybe anecdotally helps you to quantify this notion of mission and strategy and how the two really sort of dovetail together. And it's a delicate dance of really reasoning in the quietest hours of your day, either early in the morning or somewhere where you can really be alone with your thoughts as leaders, and really, really trying to figure it out. Now, the other thing is, as you pointed out, we have these contracts with the town, and Franklin has a pretty good one with the town where they actually tell us that our charter is to work with the citizens of Franklin, etc., through all forms of media, present and future. I didn't craft that phrase, but I love it. So I don't call that quite a mission statement, but it certainly is a great ingredient in getting to a mission statement and forcing me to think about where we're going long term. So some of the language sometimes comes to you through the history of the organization, and look back on that, and that creates a vector for where you might want to go in the future.
Thank you, Peter. Did you have anything, Eric, that you'd like to add to that?
Sure, I'll just briefly add. I think the mission discussion at the board level is obviously something not to take lightly, but there are so many disruptors going on in this world. Business models are being challenged. Sectors are being challenged. Look at what's happening in higher education. I mean, their whole industry is being transformed by government regulations, student need, and costs, and physical plant, et cetera. So all these different sectors are going through this massive transformation. And boards and governing bodies need to be aware of these types of transformations and industry changes to constantly, not just during the strategic planning process, but constantly be asking, are we aligned to the future? Is our mission archaic, or does it align to the future? Because if it doesn't align to the future, we need to have a conversation really quickly. The downside is going into the strategic planning process with boards too quickly and touching on mission too quickly. Because if I don't have an educated board about where industry is heading and what's going on, and I bring up mission, we may get the archaic definition of a mission for our organization, and that's not going to serve anybody any good. And also personalities and people change. Boards turn over. You know, whether you have term limits and they turn over every 3, 6 years, et cetera, or people just phase out. And as people change, that board develops a new culture, a new mentality, a new philosophy for governing. And in that philosophy, you have to recognize whether or not the mission is now changing in the mindset of the board, because they need to be aligned with the executive director. And if they're not aligned, then you're going to have a real conflict there, and they need to be both following that same mission. So there's a bunch of different conversations that could happen, but you really need to start with assessing where are things at with the organization. What type of things are going on in the sector? Are we up to speed? Is the board knowledgeable? Are they ready to have this discussion? So all these different things play a part in really understanding how to unfold that discussion within the strategic planning process.
Thank you, guys. Actually, it kind of leads a little bit to the next question. Do you feel that the executive director should take most of the responsibility in creating this? Do you think the board should take most of the responsibility in creating this? Should it be a 50-50 split? How should the executive director and the board work together to make this happen?
I have a wonderful board. I am blessed. There are 7 people who are involved in our organization day to day. They produce programs. I can call any of them on the phone for help, and they always step up. And so we have a lot of engagement outside of our formal board meetings. So I don't have to explain to them the minutiae, the ins and the outs, etc. But they actually get to experience what we do, returning to my favorite word, as clients in the first person. So that's my relationship with my board. It's great. President stops by every day, spend a few minutes talking shop. So a lot of information goes on. We are always tightly coupled. But who owns the leadership? It's all on me. And I don't say that as a point of control. I say that as an obligation. If you're going to be a strong executive director, step up. It's a whole lot easier to get in front of it and inform your board and be the conduit of information for them that's useful than to think that you have to go to them for every little thing. And you can change that culture as executive directors by constantly feeding them. So not only do we have our formal meetings and our regular engagement, I do email out board memos on a regular basis of things that are happening. I write a pretty regular passage that goes out with some formality to the board by email. What's going on in the industry? What is happening right now with cord cutting? What is happening right now with social media? What is happening right now with radio, because we're building a radio station? And so I just keep pushing information. And what happens when you keep on pushing out that information is 2 things. Number 1, you become a very reliable conduit of truth. And number 2, you are imbued with the privilege of leadership. That's how you do it, by getting information to them when and where they need it. So I really think the executive director has to be a big, big driver. And that doesn't mean stepping on your board or pushing them around. It means giving them everything that they need. As we talked about when we ran around frantically looking for buildings and whatnot a few years ago, giving them everything they need so they have traction. And when you give them that traction, they tend to align with your thinking because they feel in their bones that inherently you're comfortable with your decisions and you're probably right.
Thank you. Eric?
It's It's a tough question. It really depends. The board and the executive director have very different roles. They should be both responsible in partnership for crafting a strategic plan together. But then after it is done, they both have separate roles. It's the role of the ED to go operationalize that plan and the board to hold them accountable. However, a lot of boards don't have the conversation about how do we, as a board, need to change to match the change that is in the strategic plan. Because if we're expecting the operational side and the executive director to go implement these changes and we're not set up to support that, well then we're disconnected from the get-go. So it's really important to start having those conversations of how do we have a plan within the plan for the board? Because they need to change and adapt as well. And in many cases, they need to change quicker and adapt more than the operational side, because the operations folks are the ones who are dealing with this day to day, so they know what's happening. They see the technology changes. The board may not do that, so you may have a lengthier change process with the board, but they need to align as well. In reality, usually the person with the biggest, clearest vision is the one that's going to drive most of the strategic conversations. Mm-hmm. It's like when you go to a meeting. The person that has the agenda makes the rules. Right? They crafted the agenda, they know how they want to lead the meeting. The same thing with the person with the biggest, clearest strategy and vision for that strategy. They're the ones that are going to drive those discussions. And they're going to be the centers of influence. And that could be the board chair, or it could be the CEO, or it could be somebody else. You don't know within the planning process. But regardless of who it is, everybody's got to come along to build the plan and move together.
To your point, by the way, if I may, when I was saying I send out information to the board, and they do with that what they will, our board opted to become fiscally more conservative. Mm-hmm. So they asked me to find $500,000, which I did, because they became concerned about the cord cutting and where we're going and how we might want to have a cash reserve, not only for ops survival, but have an opportunity to figure out what direction we want to go in. So in talking to my board the way we were, I was giving them the tools they needed to take a position long term. Now, that means I'm spending less money. There are sacrifices I have to make today, but I'm okay with that, mm-hmm. because I feel comfortable that they feel comfortable, that they're making the right decision. So I think what I'm trying to say here is this is what he's speaking about, is how do you empower your board to be in sync with you, not always in agreement, but at least in sync, and collectively to get to the right place.
Yeah, and the board has a fiduciary responsibility to the financials.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
That also means revenue.
Yep.
And how are they connecting you to the community? I mean, is fundraising a 4-letter word? Those are big discussions. As 501c3s, you have the ability not to have all your eggs in one basket, but to diversify that revenue through fundraising opportunities. Mm-hmm. And that can come through the community, and that can come through grants as well. But they're conduits and stewards to some of those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, guys. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree. A lot was already said. I think it really depends on what kind of executive director you have. I mean, there are visionary executive directors, and then there are managers who are executive directors, mm-hmm. Who have ability to drive work that's been defined for them, and they can drive that, right? So they play a management role versus a leadership role, where they're thinking about what, not only getting the information to their board about cord cutting, but what implications does that have on us today and also 3 years from now, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a very different skill set, executive skill set, right? And so I think it has to be collaborative, right? Because if the executive director doesn't buy in to where the board wants to go in the strategy, that creates a very difficult relationship between the board chair and the executive director, which, I mean, I thought I saw, don't quote me on this stat, but I might just make one up anyway. I'm not making it up. But somewhere around 21% of all executive directors that go through a strategic planning process resign. Part of that is I can't imagine myself going in that direction. Part of it is I can't imagine myself having the skills to be able to drive this. And part of it is it was so exhausting, I'm done. right? And so many leaders of nonprofit organizations are often threatened by the idea, they know they need a strategy, but they're threatened by the idea of a strategic planning process, which, because now we're getting feedback from people, and especially the more the constituents give feedback, now becomes somewhat of a judgment, right? And so it can be somewhat unnerving if you're not completely confident in where you're going and driving and leading this organization. And so it's a very interesting question, because it really depends, and I would agree with you, it depends. But the loudest voice often is the one that's heard. Whoever has the clearest strategy is going to be the one that drives that process.
I'd like to add one other thing about process and some other things with respect to, okay, where does good information come from and how do you weigh it? Anybody here ever read the book Megatrends by John Nesbitt back in the early 80s? A strong recommend on Nesbitt's books, because Nesbitt did a couple things. Not only did he frame several megatrends, really, really big trends in society that were happening as a futurist, but the thing that Nesbitt did was really kind of unveil in his book his process. And his process was very practical. I refer to as weighing the ink. In other words, what he did was he took a look at what was going on in the press in terms of actually measuring out column inches of importance. Today we see it as news cycles where stuff blows up for 24 hours and goes away, etc. But there's value in being able to track specific trade sites on the internet and periodicals, etc., and to form your network of information, of inbound information, and then to see how things are shifting within all of that, and to pull the stats from that. And a lot of that information I then pass on directly to the board in unedited form, including the links, go check it yourself, etc. And then I provide sort of my analysis of what goes on with that. But the idea of being able to weigh the ink, even in cyberspace, turns out to be really valuable in terms of assessing the longer term impact of things. And this was a technique that I used also in my past career. Now, the numbers are, of course, changing, but one of the things, a philosophy that I ascribe to is that nothing kills nothing. In other words, if you look at it as a bell curve of information, on the south side of the bell curve, there are the naysayers who will say something will never happen. On the north side of the bell curve, there are the promoters who believe that there's a golden harvest waiting for this next big thing, and they're trying to maximize their profit from it. So they have a bias. So there are biases on both sides. There's the legacy bias of it'll never happen because people don't want it to happen, and people who say it has to happen because that's where my money's coming from. And then somewhere within that bell curve of information, you look at the stakeholders, you position the stakeholders in terms of those biases, and you sort of bring it together. And you create something that's called a logistics curve. A logistics curve is an adoption curve. That is, it starts out kind of here, and as it goes on in time, suddenly you get this sort of what engineers call a hysteresis response, a switch. And cord cutting right now is going through that. So in analyzing cord cutting where we are now, my numbers of the moment say that over the next 5 years, cord cutting will probably cost us about 40% of our revenues and sort of settle out. And part of that is that there are forces that want to keep the cable model alive, which means adjustments with lower prices, better bundling, modifying services. But cable doesn't go away. You know, this isn't going to be the death of that, but there's going to have to be some adjustment. And so adjusting my logistics curve by the numbers as we go, month by month. And I do believe that at this point we're about 6 months into what I refer to as a tipping point. The tipping point where really things start to happen, and then you see the ramp, which takes place over the next 3 years to get to, you know, call it the new normal or whatever. But there are things that work against cord cutting. For instance, the horrible user interface experience. The fact that it's probably 2 minutes to get to the program that you actually wanted to watch, rather than just a channel change. There are actual barriers to entry. There's the reliability of service over however it is that you're connected, and a number of things that the plus side stakeholders are trying to grapple with. Meanwhile, cable is looking to improve its experience, drive down costs, do what they can to retain. So in trying to meet in the middle, just doing the business analysis on it, that's sort of where my thinking is right now. So all of that sort of speaks to strategy, and now we apply that to, all right, what does that mean for our mission statement in terms of budgeting? Where are we going to come out of this whole thing on the other side, and what do we do to maximize the dollars that we do have to improve our services in that new normal?
Thank you. So we're flying by here. It's 11:20. I want to ask one more question, then I want to leave about 20 minutes for Q&A. So actually, this is a great question for you, Eric. Bringing in an outsider, is it a good idea? What are the benefits? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'll give you my biased opinion of having an unbiased opinion. It is, so you have your board, you have your staff, and there's a set culture. There's a set way of doing things, a set belief, a set process.
Because we've always done it that way.
Because you've always done it that way, exactly. We fear change, or we fear dramatic change. And so having somebody come in that has an objective view, is unbiased to the business model or any kind of established methodology, thinking, or culture, is really valuable to the organization, because they're going to be able to help problem solve in a different light. They're going to be able to ask the tough questions. They are going to be able to address the elephant in the room. And those things really help the organization come together. You know, we don't want to sit around and talk about leadership and culture and innovation. That's useless. We want to talk about high-performing goals and where we want to head. And working together to solve those problems will create teamwork and leadership and communication and innovation. A lot of times that's hard to do with an internal facilitator, because that person comes with silos or cliques or certain reputation, etc. But having somebody come outside from the outside alleviates some of that pressure, and so you start with a clean slate from the get-go.
Quick question for you. Dovetail what you just said, which I think is key, with the notion of creating change agents.
I don't know if you're necessarily creating change agents. You use the bell curve model, so you've got your early adopters in there.
Yes, we do.
And you've got your visionaries. And so if I want to move forward with change, I want to identify who the change agents are, not try to create them. And those are the people that are going to be strong advocates, that when they speak at a meeting, people stop talking and they listen. They have key influence from a positive standpoint. They're not going to be the laggards that are never coming along, like you referenced. Right. And so those are more important to identify during the change process.
Rob, when you were doing your process, did you have anybody from the outside come and help out? And if you did, what was the benefits? If not, what could have been the benefits?
Yeah, so Scott did have an outside consultant come in and start working that process. I came in after the strategy was already developed, so I don't want you to misunderstand that I wrote the strategy. I'm actually interpreting the strategy at this point. I think, to dovetail on what you said, I think I'm biased as well to having outside facilitation, because I think you get all the things that Eric just talked about around that objectivity, doesn't have the historical alliances, don't have the things that are going to kind of cloud judgment, and really being an honest feedback to both the executive director of the board and any other constituents that are involved with the process. But I think finding the right person is really important. And I think don't just interview one person, interview several people, because fit and understanding your context and your culture is really important. To really understand what you're trying to accomplish and be able to then help guide the conversation initially to set up the then methodologies in which to gather the information and all that kinds of things. So spend time really getting to know who you're going to bring in, if you're going to bring somebody in. and what they can actually provide for you. If it's out of the box, and I'm sure neither one of us would ever do that, but if it's an out of a box kind of approach to strategic planning, that's not necessarily what you need because of the changing landscape and the environmental factors that are going to impact any kind of strategic planning that you have going on in your organization. So,
Peter?
As far as outsiders, I mentioned that when I went to Franklin, the first thing I did was get the board to go outside. Now, the Cable Advisory Board, 5 years before my time, hadn't really visited any other place. And so there was this myopia. And taking them to an organization like this one, and just seeing that simple statement on the wall, TV for you, by you, or going to another organization, say Newton TV, your vision channeled. All of these are wonderful statements because they all sort of are very near each other, and they try in an emotional way to say this is what we're about in the simplest of terms. Again, that reduction to essence we talked about. But the thing is, I deployed the board to reach out to all of the other people who are sitting here right now as outside influencers. In other words, we are part of a community, and there's a lot to learn from each other. So there's the mix of the formality of working with people whose charter is to do this, and that's very good, because they are a forcing function, an important one. And then there is, many hands make light work, and none of us is as smart as all of us. So having an opportunity to get my board to go outside and see the other operations was a great jump start. And on their own, they continue to do that today. So they show up, hey, I stopped by thus and such while I was out of town in another state, and I got to see that operation. I went and I visited, etc. Here's what I came back with. So the process continues because they've been empowered to do that. So everybody on my board is a change agent.
Thank you, guys. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. We're recording this, so please raise your hand and I'll pass the microphone to you. So does anybody have a question?
I think the most likely person to address the question to is Bob. When you're in the process of trying to choose whether to bring in an outsider or not, what do you think would be the relative advantages or disadvantages of getting an outsider who is pretty much totally disconnected from your sphere, outside your particular industry, but maybe more involved in just general facilitation, versus someone who is outside your own organization, but within your sphere, or connected to your sphere in some way. I mean, cable access is way different from broadcast.
right.
But you still might want to get a broadcast guy to come in and help you out. There's a lot to be gained. Just look at Peter. I mean, he's been in the broadcast industry forever. So what do you think?
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about community access television when I took this role, zero. The board was not looking for somebody that was an expert in cable access, right? They were looking for somebody who was a management consultant that was going to have the ability to bring stability to the organization, was able to make a couple of key hires, and was able to look at the processes that are going on internally in the organization so that it could set the stage and launch the success of the next person that comes in to lead this organization through the strategic plan over the next 3 to 5 years. So it depends on what you need. So if you need technical advice in how to run the station, then that's a different person than somebody who needs to come in and kind of assess where you are, your current reality, and then be able to put that up against what your vision is for your preferred future. And it's in that tension, right? So if there's a rubber band between the current reality, and most people don't spend enough time really being honest and taking an inventory of the current reality. Oh, things are fine. How many times have you ever heard that from an employee or a person who's in charge of a division? How are things going? Oh, they're fine in the news department, right? And well, I used to do this with kids, right? I used to ask kids that are working within the inner city context, how are things going? Oh, things are great. Yeah, well, I heard you just got kicked out of your house, so you're homeless. You just lost your job because you don't have an address, so you're unemployed, and there's a kid looking to kill you. So how is that fine, right? That's not an honest inventory of current reality, right? So if your vision is to go to college, then you don't know how to get there because you don't know where you're starting. Same thing happens organizationally, is that we don't get really honest with where we're at. We don't have those conversations about the elephant in the room. And we're not willing.
There's an elephant?
Yeah, right.
A pink one.
Yeah, all of a sudden it's like with this little thing, and all of a sudden you realize you start to scratch the surface for 2 seconds. External people can assess that pretty quickly because they're not tied to emotionally what's going on in the organization, right? So, but if you need somebody technically, get somebody that's going to help you technically. If you need somebody to help you think through a strategy, that's a very different person that's going to be able to do that. And if you need some interim crisis management, that's again, I think, another person, right? Or it could be a combination of the other two. So.
Having done outside consultants, I'm actually a fan of outside voices. So I think that bringing people in at the right time and for the right reasons, sometimes that's a board decision, sometimes that's an ED decision. And there's another influencer, by the way, which is always, the budget. One of the things that I use just as a quick rule of thumb to understand a given facility's, call it throw weight. If you take the number of inhabitants in a town, just go to Wikipedia, type in town name, you'll get a town. Usually there's a little box off to the right of the screen that says how many souls on board. You look at that number and you multiply it by 4, and then you multiply that times whatever is in the contract for payments. Usually it's 4.8%, 5%, somewhere in there in Massachusetts. Now, there are some facilities that might be getting, say, 3%. But you take that percentage for whatever the access fee is, times 4, times the number of inhabitants. That gives you the operations annual budget within 5%. Now that you know how big a pond we have, it shapes what the issues for the organization might be, how big or small the problems are, to the extent that they might need outside consulting or they need to solve the problem internally. Now, we all wear the hat, executive director. Some of us have to be more hands-on because we work in smaller organizations. Some of us have the luxury of staff depth, so we're able to put more of our energies into longer view strategy thinking, but with that the obligation of managing more bodies. So the executive director's role changes a bit with the size of the organization, and with that the executive director's dependency on outside voices, consultants, and people who can help that person. An executive director in a small operation probably needs more, as you were pointing out, technical guidance. So part of it is understanding sort of where you are in the hierarchy of budgets drives what you need to go outside for.
I think also asking for references,
Yeah.
identifying some questions from your board as to how what's our board look like, and then what would we want from somebody, and then asking those references, those tough questions. I think will shed a lot of light on finding the right person, the right individual, and meet with a bunch of people, because it's going to give you different personalities of who you want to work with.
We have time for 1 or 2 more. I saw your hand first.
You had mentioned Peter.
This is television.
I talk loud, sorry. You had mentioned, Peter, that you were asked to raise $500,000, so I'm curious what your secret was in order to make that happen.
And do you want
I'm surprised it took that long for
Yes,
the
I would
questions to
like
come up.
No, happy to.
I don't have
So I was
the.
asking to say, that's my question too.
I threw an entire control room overboard from my original plan. We have a control, I built 2 studios in our building. So one of them has no control room in it. The control room consists of a roll-around baker's rack with a couple of pieces on it, and change the strategy with what equipment we could deploy. Actually turned out to be for the better. A lot of it also is sweat equity. Now, for me, the good fortune is I can build these facilities in my sleep. So having a lot of, I guess what I'll call practical depth on both the engineering and on the art side. I do all our artwork, I do all our engineering, deal with staffing issues. I do a fair amount of production myself. So I have a 70-hour week. Yes, I work every Saturday as well. And I do a lot of the real management of the place at 5:30 in the morning before I go to work, and on Sundays. Drives my wife a little nuts, but that's where a lot of it came from. Just working harder and asking the same thing of my staff, because they see me do it and they step up. So that's been our culture, is to run very lean and mean. And we did succeed at actually reworking our budget that way. Also, pushing out a couple of things by about a year. Still plan to do them, but we're still building some revenues. So we were able to remap our original development plan to help out with that.
So did you reach out, referring to the 4-letter word, with fundraising and outside sources in order to get some extra money above what your budget was?
No, we did that all within existing funds.
Yeah, so there's the difference between fund development, finding new money, and organizational development, which is restructuring your organization in order to realize savings that ends up being real dollars in the long run, especially if you're looking to create, a bankroll. Two different, very different approaches, can yield really great results. With some cost. I mean, you have an executive director who works 70 hours a week, and you probably have staff that work 50 to 60, right? So there are some costs to either one of those. But fund development is also another one, and it's an interesting one in this field, right? Because it's really around the arts money, and it's around. So where do you go to develop a fund development plan in this landscape is an interesting proposition for sure.
Now, in our case, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because we had to pay for a building, we had to pay for a lot of new gear. We built a new facility in the high school as well, which is a 5,000 square foot plant. And so I think for me, the good news is that we're getting near the end of that development cycle over the course of the next year. So we're going to go through a major change in the next year, where we're going to be bringing on bodies, we're going to actually be fleshing out the staff, doing a lot of things that, quite frankly, we've denied ourselves right now in order to get the building and the facility and our core capabilities right. So another thing about strategy and mission statement is understanding how it is going to evolve over time.
Exactly.
And our board is totally good with that. So even though right now we're being pretty productive at, between 500 and 600 programs a year, I always want to do more, and so I want to bring up the metrics even more. And while we're on metrics, by the way, coming from the commercial side, when I ran my production company, one of the things we're starting to implement in terms of value proposition is we are putting a price tag on every production we make. It's the other side of that client relationship. If you're a client, if you paid for this, this is what it would have cost. So our editing time, our studio time, the cameras, all of that stuff is all embedded in a spreadsheet, and we look at every single production as though it was a work for hire. And we actually develop what it is that we create as value as a financial statement. So we have an outbound financial statement, which is somewhat unique, as opposed to all the inbound financial statement about where's our next meal coming from, or our funding. We actually talk in very real dollars about the value we create. My target is 2x. In other words, for whatever funding we got, can we honestly claim that we did something to generate twice the value? So again, going to my numbers, 32,000 souls on board times 4.8 times 4 gets you to 19x, which gets us to a somewhere between $660,000 to $680,000 annual budget, which is what we're running right now, and I have to generate $1.4 million worth of value.
I think that's also an opportunity.
Absolutely.
If you can communicate your external value and you can justify what that is from a social capital standpoint
Bingo.
within your communities, then you are then marketable to community foundations. Essex County Community Foundation, Lowell Foundation,
Great
Metro
reporting
West
tool.
Foundation, and you can use that value proposition to say, hey, I need a grant for strategic planning, which they all do, or I need a grant for this capital investment or this program investment, which they're giving. And there's a trend moving in foundations now to give less grants, but higher amounts of money. Usually the average amount community foundations are giving is $2,500, which you could probably spend in the snap of your finger, right? Towards giving real meaningful dollars to invest in your organization to build capacity of the $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 mark. And if you can describe that value in building that social capital, you can justify a lot of those larger grants.
I mean, you can hear the way Peter just talks about his strategy and vision and mission, just the way he articulates everything. So not only with that SRO, the SROI of what he does, creating value, used as an external marketing and fundraising tool, but it also can be something that you use as an internal management tool with your staff. How are we creating 2x value with this production, right? So it becomes a tool then that you can use in very many different ways to have a huge impact on your client.
It also lines up very nicely with the service and manufacturing model. If you understand business and how businesses actually take in their cash, what their wholesale costs to make, and what it is they're worth on the street retail, you find out that the model that I'm using, both from the commercial production industry and the manufacturing industry, because we're sort of a mix of manufacturing and service, the financial model actually holds up really, really well, and allows us to evaluate what we're doing as a nonprofit as though we had to survive as a profit-making organization. What does that look like? So it's a valuable reporting metric in that sense of our general health.
We have time for one more question over here. Robert?
This goes back to what the bulk of the conversation was, the last question, and the first question asked from the audience is, some of you know that I ran as executive director of Lowell for a number of years, and while we were asked to do a 5-year strategic plan, we weren't asked so much as we recognized the need to do a 5-year strategic plan. Now, having been an executive director for a great many years, I don't know, maybe I wasn't there the day at the university, public access university, on how to create a strategic plan. But what I did do were two things that I thought that go right back to the question of what you were talking about. You'll learn the term stakeholders. Who are the people that have a stake in your organization that are both internal and external? So I got one of my technical people and one of my management people, and we formed an ad hoc committee. Then we brought in a large partner that was a nonprofit, someone from the government, someone from the school department, and a couple of other large stakeholders, and that formed this ad hoc committee. And then what we did is we brought in an outside consultant to drive the entire process for us, because I don't know how to do a strategic plan. I had never done one before. And that partner was able to come in, and in our case, Jericho Road is a volunteer organization, so we didn't have to pay for it, although the community foundations and grants are a great idea. But they drove the entire process for us. And we held these various events that took place within the community that would be all these nonprofits that would come in and give us their perspective of how they saw what we could be doing or should be doing from their perspective. And it gave us an opportunity to hark back to them and say, well, here's our mission and how we do this. And we saw the disconnect, but we saw a place for bridging. So there were about 6 or 7 different community events. We buy the lunch, they all come. But that person who was the consultant or that organization also was able to take all of this information and ferret out what was important. In the end, much like your annual report, a formal document was created. And that formal document is something that you could use as a marketing tool, give to your board. We couldn't have our board greatly involved. There's 29 board members in Lowell. Can you imagine 29 different perspectives all saying, here's how you should be doing it? Welcome aboard, Steve. So for us, that document and having the external consultant help drive or create the events that brought all the information into us just proved invaluable in our experience.
Great, thank you. So it is about 12:15. I wanted to wrap this up now and thank our panelists, Peter Fasciano, Eric Curtis, Rob Zargis. Would you guys be willing to stick around for a little bit if anybody has questions?
Sure.